Opening the door for queenside influence, this immediately probes black's central intentions with a flexible flank advance. Developing knights early is a classic way to contest the center and prepare for pawn advances. Establishing central presence, preparing to challenge black's knight and potentially open lines. Opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop and preparing to solidify the center's pawn structure. Developing this knight immediately supports the center and prepares for a potential kingside fianchetto, aiming for a robust pawn structure. Challenging white's central grip, this pawn thrust opens lines and introduces dynamic play. Striking the center directly, this exchange immediately opens lines and forces black to decide on their pawn structure, potentially creating a queen's gambit declined scenario. Reclaiming the center pawn opens up black's game, preparing to develop pieces actively and contest the central squares. Unpinning the knight and preparing to exploit the weakened dark squares along the d-file, a subtle positional squeeze begins. Developing the bishop harmonizes with the pawn structure, preparing for castling and subtly contesting the center. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside development, this creates a comfortable setup for white. Securing the king immediately is a sensible priority, preparing to connect the rooks. Developing the bishop to a good diagonal targets the kingside and prepares castling, fostering harmonious piece play. Restoring the rook to the open file, black prepares to challenge white's central dominance and potentially activate kingside pressure. Developing the knight to e2 frees up the f3 square for another piece, potentially preparing a kingside pawn storm or supporting a central advance later. Developing the knight to d7 fortifies the e5 square and prepares to shift pieces towards the kingside, aiming for a harmonious setup. Asserting central pressure, the queen now eyes black's kingside and aids in preparing a pawn push. Repositioning the knight to f8 is a subtle maneuver, aiming to reroute it via g6 towards a better defensive square or even an attacking outpost on h5. Unleashing the kingside rook dramatically opens white's queen to menacing diagonals and signals an imminent pawn storm against black's uncastled monarch. Solidifying the pawn chain is a key defensive idea, preparing to potentially push later. Preventing dark square weaknesses and potential bishop intrusions guards white's monarch against any immediate kingside pressure. Challenging the queenside, this maneuver seeks active play and potential counterplay against white's castled king. Securing the monarch's safety on the queenside opens up avenues for queenside expansion and avoids any premature king exposure. Recentering the bishop on a more robust diagonal offers defensive support and prepares potential queenside counterplay. Unleashing a flank pawn storm now sacrifices kingside safety for initiative. Prepare for potential tactical fireworks. Challenging white's central control, this pawn thrust aims to create queenside dynamism and open lines for black's pieces. Unleashing the knight to f4 aims to disrupt black's queenside expansion and potentially target the king's defenses. Reinforcing the central d-pawn and preparing to contest the open c-file with the rook feels like a solid defensive posture. Exchanging the bishop clears the e-file for the rook and intensifies pressure on the queenside pawn structure. This rook redeployment initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to bolster the kingside defense and potentially exert pressure along the e-file. Aggressively pushing forward, white seeks to exploit the weakened kingside diagonal and cramp black's pieces with this pawn thrust. Shifting the knight to the queenside targets weak squares and prepares for potential pawn pushes, aiming to outmaneuver white's cramped pieces. Initiating a slow, probing pawn advance on the kingside, white aims to gain territory and restrict black's knight. Black solidifies the queenside pawn chain, daring white's g-pawn advance while preparing to contest the semi-open c-file. Shifting the knight to c6 offers better support for the pawn advance, a tactical reshuffle preparing for action on the queenside. Seeking initiative, black repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially eyeing the weak b2 pawn and disrupting white's kingside pawn storm. A strategic retreat to consolidate piece activity on the queenside, preparing for potential pawn advances. The bishop's infiltration to g4 creates a pin, potentially disrupting white's pawn shield and inviting tactical exchanges. Asserting control of the open g-file, preparing for a potential kingside onslaught. The bishop infiltrates, eyeing crucial dark squares and threatening to disrupt white's king safety. Opening up a surprising avenue of attack against the black king, this rook lift is a bold gambit to create immediate pressure. A daring regrouping to activate the bishop, potentially forcing concessions on the king side. Liberating the d3 bishop from its pinned pawn, white aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square. The queen repositions, seeking a new avenue of attack along the queen side, while white prepares to activate the rooks. Shifting the king grants the monarch crucial breathing room, preparing for potential pawn thrusts and reinforcing the queenside defense. This repositions the knight for better diagonal influence and to avoid the pressure on the c4 square. Pushing the king's pawn flank opens avenues for kingside attack. This audacious pawn thrust aims to seize queenside space and disrupt white's coordination. Unleashing a pawn storm to shatter black's defensive setup, potentially opening critical lines toward the king. Opening the f-file is a daring choice, creating a dynamic imbalance at the cost of some king's safety. Opening the h-file violently, this pawn capture is a calculated risk, potentially exposing your own king for a decisive attack. Solidifying your pawn structure and preparing for potential counterplay on the queenside now feels paramount. Capturing the bishop unravels black's defensive structure, opening pathways for your initiative. Relinquishing the knight and opening the king's defense, black embraces an aggressive pawn advance while hoping for kingside counterplay. Challenging the pawn structure opens critical diagonals for black's rook. The queen retreats, a strategic repositioning to consolidate the initiative after the material exchange and prepare for potential queenside expansion. Sensing an opportunity, white aims to disrupt black's queenside setup and create weaknesses. Exchanges here simplify the position, potentially relieving pressure on black's kingside and opening lines for active piece play. Exploiting the open file, this capture instantly rebalances the board and initiates a powerful pawn thrust. Securing the rook on the 7th rank promises improved mobility and a potential pawn thrust later. Reclaiming the open file is paramount for white's attack, forcing black into passive defense. Targeting the isolated queen's pawn with a swift regrouping of forces. A surprising withdrawal, aiming to regroup and defend the weakened kingside after the tactical skirmish. Shifting the queen to the kingside promises aggression, but leaves her vulnerable to white's well-placed knight. Securing the queenside pawn structure against further aggression, though it surrenders attacking momentum for defensive stability. Seizing the initiative, black aims to disrupt white's queenside coordination with a bold outpost. Centralizing the queen seeks to stabilize white's position and connect rooks, anticipating a potential queen exchange. Unleashing a surprising tactical thrust, black aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and create counterplay. A bold maneuver, aiming to exploit the now open queenside files and potentially disrupt black's rook coordination. Trading queens simplifies the position, offering black a clearer path towards endgame complications with their active rook. The capture on d1 initiates a simplified endgame where pawn structure becomes paramount. A dynamic pawn push now opens vital avenues for the rooks. Forces the inevitable queenless battle, simplifying into an endgame where pawn structure and piece activity will be paramount. The king steps out of the pawn's shadow, seeking sanctuary on the back rank as the rooks finally clear. Reactivating the rook allows white to contest open files and prepare for the rook endgame. The rook's recapture opens lines, potentially creating dynamic pawn play and targeting weak squares. Securing the king by advancing the monarch to a more protected square is a prudent defensive maneuver in this tense endgame. The black king now ventures from its safe haven, seeking respite on the kingside, a potentially risky excursion with the queenside pawn structure exposed. Stepping the king to the center solidifies its defensive presence, preparing for the inevitable pawn advances and potential exchanges ahead. Reactivating the c-file rook offers a strategic outpost and prepares for potential piece exchanges in this evolving endgame. Seeking to consolidate the queen's rook, this maneuver aims to solidify the kingside pawns and prepare for a central pawn push. The king's journey to the center begins, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame. Repositioning the knight to control the central d4 square and prepare for potential pawn advances is a sound choice in this endgame transition. Introducing a knight to the c3 outpost instantly complicates the pawn structure and opens avenues for counterplay. Reinforcing the knight's central claim, this move prepares for a potential pawn advance, aiming to restrict black's pieces. The king seeks sanctuary, initiating a cautious repositioning to evade any immediate threats. Opening the queenside offers white a chance to free up white's position and potentially activate the rook. Securing the rook's outpost on the queenside allows black to prepare for a potential kingside expansion later. Opening the queenside file decisively, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain active rooks. The pawn push opens a diagonal, aiming to exploit the exposed black king in the coming exchanges. Simplifying the position by trading rooks activates the white rook on a1 for immediate activity. A daring repositioning, this knight seeks better activity on the queenside despite the pawn structure's current limitations. Activating the rook to exploit the open file, threatening to penetrate black's weakened queenside. Repositioning the knight aims to exploit the open b-file and potentially penetrate white's queenside defenses. Liberating the knight to attack the queenside pawn structure is a bold positional gambit. Repositioning the rook to the central file will help secure the knight and prepare for potential counterplay. Securing the d5 pawn with a timely advance unlocks central pawn play and limits black's knight options. Sensing an opportunity, black mobilizes the king towards the center, aiming to reactivate its dormant defensive and offensive potential in this complex queenside scenario. Activating the king centrally prepares for kingside defense and potential pawn advances in the simplified position. Sacrificing a pawn now opens critical files for the rook and might create attacking chances. Seizing the open files with the rook offers a promising path to victory. Challenging white's initiative, this pawn advances, aiming to create dynamic possibilities on the kingside or facilitate a passed pawn push later. Repositioning the rook to the kingside aims to pressure the black pawn chain. Seeking to activate the knight, but it ventures into a vulnerable outpost without immediate support. Unleashing the rook to hunt the enemy king opens a direct assault. The king seeks sanctuary on the kingside, away from the exposed central files. Unleashing a decisive discovered attack, forcing the king into a precarious, exposed position. The king's central outpost provides a vital attacking anchor, threatening immediate disruption in the opponent's ranks. Knight sacrifice opens a decisive central file for the rook. Seeking refuge from the relentless knight pressure, the king scrambles to safety before white's pawns can fully encircle it. Doubling pawns on the d-file creates a strong central pawn chain, aiming to restrict black's pieces and prepare for a kingside advance.